We're going to talk today about breed sovereignty and trait selection for regenerative farming. My name's Rayner. I've got a brilliant panel. I'll let them introduce themselves properly. But first, I'm going to go through a little bit about the background as to why we think it's worthy of a Groundswell session. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a research project that we've been doing, talking to regenerative practitioners around what they are looking for when selecting traits for their farms. And then after that, I'm going to pass on to the panel. We're going to have a hopefully vibrant discussion about exactly that topic. So I won't actually go into too much detail about my findings because I think these guys are hopefully going to cover some of that too. So, but first, just before we get started, to get a bit of a vibe of the people in the room, can I get a hands up if you're a farmer? Oh, good number of farmers. And a hands up if you're a livestock farmer or you have livestock. Great. And if you are thinking of getting livestock. Great. Good selection. Cool. So, click onto my slide change. Why breed sovereignty? So I'm sure a lot of you are pretty aware that we've got only a few companies producing the majority of all farm animals that are produced for food, and that is a pretty risky situation. We end up with reduced resilience to things like disease and such, but also we found that they've been selected very much within a commercial system, which means that when we take them out of that system and into a more regenerative system, ultimately they might not be so suited to that. So I'm a bit of a chicken fan. I know a little bit about chickens, and I'm going to use chicken as an example of how far that's really gone. So you may or may not know, there's two main chicken, so the three largest chicken genetics companies, one of which is based in China, and there's not that much information available about, but the other two within the kind of Western world are Hendrix Genetics and EW Group. Within that, they own multiple companies. So Hendrix own Shaver, you might have come across, and ISA also you might have come across. And then EW Group, they own Highline and the Lohman birds. EW Group also produce Aviagen, which is the Ross meat bird, which is kind of probably half of most commercial chickens are Ross birds. And then the Hubbard, which is a slower growing meat bird as well. So essentially, we have very few players within the chicken genetics world. And I think it's just a demonstration really of how far it can go. So we're seeing that kind of same trajectory really with dairy genetics and other species too. So this picture is just the kind of the complexity, I guess, of the current chicken genetic system. So the top of the triangle is your pedigree lines, and those are owned within the kind of primary breeding companies. And then you go down to grandparent stock and the parent stock production, all within that kind of primary breeding company situation. Then you go down to another layer of complexity. Have we got a backing track? I don't know. So then we have the multiplier farms, and then we go down to egg production, and then all of the kind of additional companies in between before we end up with the eggs on our plates. So within regen, obviously, complexity is a good thing, but I think when we're leaking kind of power, we're leaking money in so many of these kind of situations, actually, it's probably not so useful for our farming systems. So what we have done, I'm from Planton Farm, and we undertook a research project looking into what people were selecting for. So I spoke to a number of practitioners, asked them about the traits that they were selecting for or trying to bring into their system, how they were doing that, and then the challenges and also opportunities for kind of future regenerative livestock breeds. And just a shout out or say thank you to San Kalpa, who were the funders for the project. This is a very scientific display of the kind of people that we were talking to. So a lot of sheep people, but no one really wanted to talk much about sheep. Had quite a lot of chicken people, and then quite a few beef producers, a few dairy, a few pigs, and then some goats as well, which was quite interesting. And then the kind of key point, which I guess is not really surprising to anyone, is that everybody I spoke to described their many, many hats that they wore. So we had operations from kind of nose to tail butcheries and through to kind of people that were just raising beef animals kind of within their only operation. So yeah, but lots of different kind of roles and hats. And then this is a little bit of a summary of that, the kind of ways that people were acquiring new animals. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think these guys will be able to explain some of them in much more detail. And then this was just a very nice quote, which I think is also not surprising, but really nice. So, ask the land whether it even is appropriate for livestock. What is the purpose of the land, and what does it want to do when selecting animals? So, I'm not gonna. That's me done. So, quick summary, and then I'm going to pass on to Fraser. He's going to introduce himself.
Yeah, do you want to do next? I had to get some pictures of shorthorns in, as many as possible. So, welcome everybody. I'm Fraser Hugill. I'm here wearing various hats, as we've already discovered. First and foremost, I'm a farmer over in North Yorkshire. Run a herd of 50 pedigree beef shorthorn cows within our farm system. We're about 400 acres thereabouts. We've really looked to integrate the cattle more and more into our farm system over the years. Very much in the past, our system was the shorthorns on part of the farm and the arable on the other. Now it's very much shorthorns across the farm with the arable. So that's the sort of one hat. The other is as a director of the Beef Shorthorn Society, hence the T-shirt. So we've got hats and T-shirts so far. That'll probably be the clothing we go into, you'll be pleased to know. So yeah, I'm a director for that. I'm chair of breed development for the beef shorthorns. It's something I'm really passionate about, and certainly in terms of forwarding the Beef Shorthorn Society. And then I also do conservation advice as part of the Flag Association up in North Yorkshire. So I run farmer clusters, working with farmers to try and deliver nature conservation and regenerative farm practices. That's me.
I'm sorry, I look distracted by the pictures. I'm Clare Hill from Planton Farm, and that's my family there. It's an 80-acre farm. We've only been there a couple of years, but it's a mixed livestock farm. We're about between 700 and 900 feet above sea level, just at the bottom of the Shropshire Hills, just below the moorland line. So we're sort of an upland farm. And we have suckler cows, meat chickens, laying hens, a forest garden, and a market garden. So we're kind of really interested in livestock integration with perennial food, and how can we start to make more from food from trees, for example. So in our forest garden, we've got 70 different species, and the chickens then graze underneath the trees.
Hi folks, Matt Aidley. I farm in Cheshire with my family. Traditionally a dairy farm, but in the past few years we've sort of set up a direct sales operation, so everything we sell goes direct to customer. So at the minute we do dairy, beef and eggs, and a number of other value-added sort of associated products. On the cow side of things, the dairy herd, Dad run a traditional sort of Holstein Friesian herd up until the late 90s. We sort of started crossbreeding them and focusing mainly on the Ayrshire breed, and I had a bit of an early background in sort of pedigree breeding and showing, quite keen on that. At one point we were going to put the whole herd towards being pedigree Ayrshire, but we sort of came to the conclusion that mixing up the breeds, actually we could get to what we wanted to a little bit quicker by bringing in other breeds. So we ended up sort of mixing Holstein Friesian Ayrshire, and recently we've added in a bit of Normandy and Norwegian Red to the blend. And we also have laying hens. We breed about half of our own replacements from the laying hens, focusing on a few sort of traditional dual purpose breeds which sort of are good for eggs, and they produce a niche meat product, which luckily we've got a customer base for. In addition to that, the other kind of livestock we breed on the farm is the Maremma Guardian dogs, which we couldn't do the pastured poultry without. And I just wanted to mention them because they're unusually for a big pedigree dog breed, they are quite fit and healthy, and they've been bred for thousands of years to be fit and healthy. And a lot of the Italian breeders, not all of them, but a lot of them, the top breeders, they actually take pride in having the dogs healthy, fit and functional. They'll be working with sheep or goats in the backfield. So it's a really interesting example of a breed that's been bred for fitness and functionality, which is just like what we're trying to do with our other kind of livestock as well on the farm. That's us.
Hello everybody, I'm George Young. I farm in South Essex with my folks and my wife. A lot of people probably know of me as an arable farmer, but at the moment that's in my past. I'm an ex-arable farmer, and now I'm an organic suckler beef farmer. So I started the herd about 4 years ago. Essentially my whole drive on the farm for a number of years now has been bringing nature back. And I fervently believe that the key thing we're missing on a lot of farms in the UK is ruminant livestock, so sheep or cows. I went down the cow route. That's kind of my heritage going back, many my ancestors and all those sorts of things. And so I looked into what kind of cows I was going to get, and I started off with red poles. I knew I wanted a native breed. And that was then when I met my lovely wife, who is also my veterinary surgeon. And I met her because not only did I buy 11 in-calf cows, but I bought in a bunch with a disease called neospora, which is a great way of losing calves. So within 2 weeks of these cows arriving, 2 of them aborted. I met Mia, and now we're married with a kid in the way. It's great. But I then struggled a little bit with the genetics involved with red poles, not enough genetics and things like that, and ended up bringing in beef shorthorns. And actually now I'm also running Angus over the top of that. So I've kind of ended up going to a situation now where I'm actually just looking to breed natives that work really functionally on my farm, pasture only, so pasture for life, organic. And that's the sort of system where they're running on paddocks, moving regularly, and also getting to use sort of these wildlife corridors that I'm creating across the farm.
Perfect. Thank you. So there's a lot of terms that come around with trait selection, breeding and such. Put a bit of a crib sheet up, but we do hope we'll also kind of go into some of this throughout the discussion. I also want to leave plenty of time for people to ask questions. So please start thinking of those too. Brill. So we're going to start with Clare. Are you ready? So just want to ask you really to talk about a little bit about the traits that you select for or try to bring into your farming system, and how that might differ to when you potentially were farming more conventionally.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because the research that Annie did as well, the kind of seeing the responses, it's really similar to the things that we think about. So I'm really interested in longevity in the cattle, and for a while I was a kind of performance-focused sheep breeder, and we had this kind of we'd cull out by a certain age because at that point it was kind of assumed that things would start to deteriorate. But actually, I kind of what I feel like we maybe were lacking there, and what we apply in the cows is the kind of wisdom that they might learn and what they're teaching the rest of the herd. And if we've only ever got a very young herd, what are we missing from some of those older cows? So I don't keep them on for the sake of it, but we don't cull out at an automatic age, and we also try and observe what they might be teaching the rest of the herd. And I should say we run a family group system, so everything is together all of the time. Of course, we have to take the bull out, and we need an animal or two to keep him company. But in the main, everything's together. So when mum calves, she's calving with last year's calf and potentially previous heifers at foot. So we see some really interesting behaviours that come from that. And in fact, this year, I don't know if anyone's seen this, I'll just mention this. We actually had one cow, and it was a heifer that calved. And then really one of our oldest cows, she's about 12, she went over and she started suckling the heifer. It was almost like to get the milk going. She didn't continue it as a bad habit. And that in a previous world would have been something we'd be like, oh, that's bad. But we just sort of sat back and watched, and she did it, and then the calf drank, and then she never went back and did it again. It's almost like she was bringing the milk in. Anyway, And that kind of leads on to the second thing, which actually, when we were running a more conventional system, mothering ability is still a thing, and a thing that was a real focus, but even more so now. But not just at that calving stage, I guess, but also kind of right the way through. Like some of that herd, like how they contribute to the herd, is something that we're also observing for. The other one, which we definitely didn't used to look at all, and we do now, is kind of like rumen size and how. I don't think it was always about weights before and daily live weight gain and growth rates, but now it's about how how is an animal going to make the best use of the tall grass that we're giving them, because in a system like that, we've got more diversity and everything else. So we want them to be able to digest forage really well. And that comes from having a kind of almost a different shape of animal. So that's a new type of thing that we're looking at that we didn't look at before. I mean, there's lots of other things that we observe. I think that's more. I'm just checking my notes to see if I think things like forage selection as well is another thing. So like, are they really good when they go into a paddock? Are they kind of taking a little bit of everything, or are they being really selective? I mean, you see that really come out in their growth rates, but observing some of that, how do they perform in this system, and how do they perform in a mob grazed system is different from the things that we were looking for before, when we were definitely more daily live weight gain only focused. I think that's it.
Yeah, well. And maybe to Matt too, how you've talked quite a lot about cattle. How might that translate into chickens? And I don't know if Matt might want to pick that up as well.
In terms of selection, I mean, obviously very limited choices in terms of where you can source chickens. Most people go for the commercial bred ones, and that's often a good choice if you don't know the genetics of certain traditional breeds, because there's very few with any productive capacity. What we're trying to do with the poultry is breed a viable, productive, but also healthy and long-lived version for that. So basically, we're very much focused on breeding from birds that have proven themselves in the system for a year or two first. So we're not breeding for first-year pullets. We're selecting them out and culling them out at various stages through the year. So the only ones that hit the breeding pens are ones that we know have been in full production and stayed healthy for 1, 2, 3+ years. It's health and production and ones that fit the system.
Real. I think what came out of the research quite a lot was this kind of whole animal approach, which I think is just quite a nice way of kind of coining, I guess, everything that you've both said. Perfect. Brill. So Matt, on to you again. Sorry. We've got lots of different approaches that were up on that screen of ways of acquiring animals and genetics into the system. Can you talk a little bit about these? Maybe talk a little bit through mob breeding, maybe line breeding, and the various benefits of these different options.
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of sourcing replacement females, not always easy to do, to find the ones that suit your system, unless you hit lucky and find a herd that's dispersing, for example, or someone who's got a genuine group of females for sale. So I think most people sort of following our kind of way of doing things would be very much focused on breeding their own, and that's certainly what we've seen. Is the more generations we can be breeding something on the place, they've adapted to the feedstuffs on the place, the different challenges and conditions on the place. So again, that really comes down to what we're trying to do in terms of strategies such as mob breeding, line breeding, inbreeding, outcrossing. I mean, they've all got their place. I think the worst thing to do is if everybody's pursuing one particular thing or one particular line of genetics. Line breeding obviously is sort of following a certain bloodline, not too closely, but always going back to that, so you've got that predictability. Inbreeding is utilised sometimes by breeders to really strengthen a certain point, and obviously that's okay if you're doing it carefully, but you've always got to be ready for an outcross when you need to. And also an inbred or a line bred bull can be quite positive if you bring it into a herd, because he really stamps his progeny and you actually get maximum heterosis, hybrid vigour from the progeny from that. In terms of mob breeding, it's as it says on the board, it's a way of mimicking natural breeding patterns, because you're basically turning out multiple males with a larger group of females, all of which have been pre-selected. You apply more selection pressure to hopefully the mothers of the males. But again, that's a way of just sort of trying to do it a little bit closer to nature, let the stronger and more vigorous, more hormonally correct ones, which usually translate to being more healthy, breed. So, and actually within that mob breeding, you're not controlling which for example, bulls are breeding which cows. And actually what's happened in practice, you've got a combination of inbreeding, line breeding, outcrossing, but it's not got the human hand on it. So it's a little bit more, that's how wild animals are bred. You can look at, for example, deer or rabbits in any one area. They all look very identical. They're very similar genetically. There's no one bringing a busload of males from one end of the country to the other. But there's a little bit of movement from neighbouring populations, and the ones that survive will go on to predominate. So again, it's like a lot of the things we're talking about in regenerative agriculture is we're trying to mimic nature and not sort of push things too far our way, and just sort of be a little bit open-minded about things, obviously, but applying some selection pressure to put productive traits in there as well. But health, fertility, most things follow really.
Well, does anyone have anything to add on the different breeding strategies?
I'm just going to say what Matt just said there about the control thing. Like, there's something about we're very controlled, aren't we? We want to pick everything so precisely, and there's almost like, who do we know? Like, why do we know best? Actually, there's something about in some ways actually letting maybe nature do it. Nature's got a 10 billion year head start on us, and somehow we now think we're so clever. But it's quite hard, isn't it? To we thinking about mob breeding, but actually the reality of doing it and not having that control. But we're like, it's okay because we can DNA test afterwards, so then we'll still know who everybody is. We're not going to totally let it go, but that's something that sometimes that's quite hard to do, isn't it?
And it certainly is within a pedigree system. It's not. It doesn't go down very well. We say you just pick a mix. So yeah.
Brilliant. So yeah, you brought us nicely onto.
That was a good transition, wasn't
very
it?
Good transition.
Yeah, you would think this was organised, wouldn't you?
So clearly pedigree and breed societies have had a very historical strong strength, I guess, in maintaining and promoting certain traits. How might that align or conflict with the regen approach to trait selection?
Yeah. So, sort of coming from the shorthorn perspective, sort of we've got 200 years of hopefully not having to pick and mix in there, actually knowing what's been going on a pedigree. That probably you can trace my cows back much further, probably than you can trace my parentage back in terms of knowing what's in a herd book. But that's a challenge as well, isn't it? Because we've got a breed, well, we talk about traits, but actually often in the pedigree world, we talk about type. And sort of my shorthorn forefathers, when they were developing that herd book, were out, developing the breed by looking at type, because we probably did have that pick and mix of cattle of all different types, and herd books didn't exist. And they looked for a type. And I suppose today you could say perhaps we're trying to, again, look for a breed type, for meeting regen systems. And of course, the one thing we all know with regen is that context is everything. And picking that type for my regen system, which I think it is a regen system, but will be the different to Clare's or anybody else on the panel. So within the pedigree world, I suppose, it's that challenge of adapting. And the breed has changed. It's clearly not like what it was 200 years ago when you look at the pictures in your local pub, probably of shorthorns that you see there. And it'll continue to adapt to supply, demand, what people want. And certainly with my interest in regen and where we are with the Shorthorn Society, it's sort of recognising that we need to continue to adapt. So we're here in another 200 years, and hopefully regen's in another 200 years in terms of what we're all doing. I think if regen isn't here in another 2 years, we'll all be in a big problem. We'll all have a big problem anyway, probably more than the type of cattle we have. But making sure that the animals continue to adapt to that, but also maintaining genetic diversity. I think that's really important. And again, sort of, I'm probably a bit unusual in a number of ways, including my cattle, in that I actually quite like a lot of diversity in my herd. All our cattle aren't of a type. I've got variation, and that's probably wrong, but I like it, and I like that, and it sort of meets different markets, and also it keeps suppose it keeps my options open, because things are changing, and even different bits of the farm are different. So it's a big challenge for the pedigree world, and to keep that diversity, to keep it real, what we're doing. I think things like this are great, and meeting breeders here, because it's very different to sort of, the show scene as well, which will probably come up in the discussion, and people valuing livestock and pedigree livestock for what they can do in a regen scenario. Absolutely.
So in my kind of exploration of genetics, I guess, what I found really fascinating was that DEFRA they track the pedigree animals and the numbers. This is from someone who didn't know much about this, but and that is within their biodiversity strategy, which totally makes sense. Obviously, our farm animals are part of biodiversity, but to me, I totally separated that out. And actually, I think that it's been fascinating is fascinating that role of the Pedigree Society in maintaining it's almost like a database in its own right of genetics.
Absolutely. I suppose the pedigree is the base, isn't it, of well, in my world, the sort of cattle world, but it sort of sets that base and that type. And of course, it's not obviously, I'm probably a bit biased. Let's say really all cattle should be beef shorthorn, but that would probably be a bit insular. And it's recognising that across the range of cattle we have in the country and across the world, that diversity is really important. And as if we get it wrong and we go in the wrong direction, there's something else to come in and help meet that changing world that we've got. And likewise, I think that's the value of actually having a range of type within a breed, as well across all the livestock that's available to farmers.
Yeah, and is that true across other breeds too?
Well, I'm probably a bit biased because I only really look at my own, but because I don't think there's anything to look at. But yeah, I would hope it is. I think the shorthorn probably is a bit unusual. That there is quite a range of diversity, perhaps because we have been around 200 years, and yeah. So I wouldn't really comment on other breeds. They've all got their place.
Does anyone have?
I think it's also interesting, like Fraser was saying about the breed establishing being a type and often coming together from a bunch of more diverse cattle, because pretty much any breed we recognise as that's a breed and that's how it is, probably came about as a local type at some point, at whatever point in history, and people naturally just kept the animals which were more suited to the feedstuffs in the area and the markets in the area, and very often they'd bring a few different breeds together to do that. So it's that sort of moving picture, and it's great to have a patchwork of different breeds, as people on this panel, myself and George, sometimes it's good to just bring a few breeds together and make your own breed almost, which is what people did when they were making new breeds. So it's just good to have that, that diversity within breeds, between breeds. You can go somewhere if you need a trait and, make your own breed or make your own type.
Yeah.
Just ensure it's a shorthorn. You know what you got me on.
Does anyone anything else to comment on that? No. Brill. So George, you have started fairly recently, I guess, in your livestock venture. I'm just wondering if you could talk through some top tips or kind of steps in as a newcomer or person wanting to establish a new herd.
So I learned an awful lot very, very quickly, as you do when you start out a new venture. And I think kind of for me, one of the most important things is I had a really kind of strong plan of how I wanted to run my stock when I got them. And I was like, well, this is how I'm going to do it before I had them. And I'll slightly caveat, I did know a bit about cattle. We always used to have store cattle before, so we did have a small amount of handling equipment and some fenced fields. So I wasn't going in absolutely green. But ultimately, you have to be very open to thoroughly adapt as quickly as possible when you realize your initial plan doesn't work at all, which is absolutely fine. So I think one of the big things for me is that to realize that unless you're very, very lucky to have the opportunity to buy a dispersal sale herd and get someone's herd when they don't want it anymore, and that's for a genuine reason, if that's not the way you're getting livestock for the first time, you're always buying someone else's rejects. And I think that's really important to understand. So even if you're going to someone who is specifically a heifer breeder or something like that, and you're buying, in theory, good genetics, you're still buying the ones that they didn't keep as their replacements. So whatever happens, you're never getting the absolute best ones. But I think for me, the absolute top tip, and this might be because I've got a vet as a wife, but it is something I strongly believe in. So I am high herd health. This means that I test every single year for the 5 major diseases. So you've got Neospora, leptospirosis, BVD, IBR, and Johne's. And essentially, the way I look at it is, loads of stuff goes wrong with livestock. Sometimes they just drop down and die. Sometimes you have issues with breeding. You have really hot weather like yesterday, or specifically like we had last year, really hot weather that's going to affect your fertility. The last thing you want is to also add into the mix the chance that maybe they've got a disease, which is why they slip calves or don't get in calf or anything like that. So in terms of a really easy way of trying to make sure that you're giving yourself a bit of a leg up is to ensure that you buy from high herd health accredited herds. The slight caveat I'd say to that is the last 2 times I've bought, I'm a closed herd now, so I haven't bought in for 18 months. But the last 2 times I bought in, I did buy from high herd health accredited herds. They were accredited for BVD and Johne's, and both of those lots of cows had Johne's in them. So Johne's is really hard, by the way. But yeah, you'll never get perfect, but that's a really good way to start doing things. And then I'd say kind of on from that, when you've got the herd on the farm, you then have to decide what you're going to start tackling as your kind of prime thing. Where do you want to head for a start? And it's hard when you're starting out because you want to build your numbers because you're not financially viable when you're not building your numbers. And cattle especially takes bloody ages. I'm 4 years in. We're up to 96 head and I'm selling 6 or 7 fat this year. Like in terms of a financially good decision, it's probably not it to be a beef farmer quite yet. A few years' time, hopefully. But yeah, so it takes a really long time to kind of turn that around. And so consequently, the next thing after health that I'm focusing on is fertility. So we run just over 6 weeks for our bulling blocks. Basically, a cow cycles every 21 days, slightly shorter than a human. So each cow gets just over 2 cycles. If they don't get in calf, essentially, and there's always a little bit of give and take, but essentially that's them gone. So for me, really focusing on fertility now that I've sorted out my health, fertility, and essentially then the next thing for me is the ability to calve at 2 because your finances look a lot better. So those are the sorts of things that I would say now, if I could talk to myself 4 years ago, that's what I'd be telling myself then.
And how did you go about choosing your base herd?
Well, I knew nothing. So actually, as it happened, we'd been, because as I said, we'd used to have stores on the farm, and it was the first time we had been stockless on the farm for a long time. We'd been stockless for 6 months, and Dad knew that I wanted to get some cows at some point. And so he was getting agitated that we had no livestock on the farm, so he went on some probably slightly shoddy websites, and I'd done enough research to realise that red poles were a good start for me. Essentially, they're meant to be easy calving. Again, any pedigree, any native pedigree says they're easy calving. The consequences of lots of bad breeding over the past however many decades mean that no native breed is easy calving unless you breed it yourself to be easy calving. But anyway, so Dad had then looked for red poles, found some not too far away from me. They bred in a forest, like somewhere where people could walk their dogs, hence the Neospora. And anyway, so I went up. I knew nothing. So they had a list. They were selling in-calf cows. They had a list of when these cows were going to calve. So I was like, right, well, let's buy ones that are in a relatively tight window of calving. That's how I chose them. It's not the best way of doing it, but ultimately, until you get them on your farm, you've got no idea what you want.
Yeah. Does anyone have any? Claire, how did you choose your base herd?
Yeah, so we knew I didn't have a set breed that I wanted, pedigree or not pedigree, or all of those decisions. For me, it was about finding a breeder that had been selecting. And for a system, the type of system that we were running. So we needed we needed cows that were going to perform well in a tall grass grazing, holistic plan grazing system. And so it was based on the breeder that we went for. And so Rob Havard and Phepson Angus was a natural one for us. And he didn't have any spare females at the time. And so but what he did was put me in touch with a farm right in the north of Scotland, who he'd been supplying genetics to. So that although they weren't running, and this would be what George is saying, like it wasn't perfect because they weren't running a tall grass grazing system, but I knew that stuff was in there somewhere. And so that's how we did it. And then we have how we've suffered with that exactly when he was having a like partial herd dispersal, but of course it's always the bottom end that you get. So then we have had for year one particularly like problems that I was not expecting to have, and like easy calving with 10 animals having to get involved in 3 calvings was like we'd had run between 70 and 120 cows before Solaires and got involved in like 1 calving in 10 years, and here I was 3 calvings in 10 animals. It was like I didn't know what was going on. But then this year that's already shifted, so that it's already changed, but it doesn't go perfectly straight away. But yeah, it was about that that type of system we've got, and within there's some cows that are absolutely brilliant and really thriving well, and some that are those ones that haven't gone quite so well, and so we're filtering those out. But the other thing was the disease thing as well. So when Rob said, "Oh yeah, I haven't got any, but why don't you speak to this guy?" and he's like 3 hours north of Inverness, I was like, "Nice, perfect." So it was great because they came from that was a high health herd, and that was another. We have the same requirement because you just see such decimation when people bring in. And even just like even that disease might be present and not showing itself on the farm that it's on, but then you bring those animals into a new environment, and then suddenly for whatever reason that shows itself, and we just don't know. That's that thing, like we just don't know. So but at least going for a high health herd is the right thing to do. So yeah, for us it wasn't. Now we are pedigree Angus breeders because that's what we've ended up buying is pedigree Angus, and that's what we're and that's what we're doing. But yeah, for us it's about how they perform in a regen graze system.
Is there, and what's the kind of, I guess if someone was new and wanted to find out the various breeds, what does the Breed Society role in that?
Well, I think I'd sort of second what these guys first of all have said already, and I think it was Clare you just said in terms of as much picking the person and who you're getting them off. Like if you come to me and ask me about a jack, I'll send you to the pickup because I want to change the tyre, not to get a calf out of a cow. I don't possess one, and I don't ever intend to. I would get rid of the cows. So I think that's really important. So we can all look at figures and things like that, but I think there's some real basics in terms of the person, and also to second that what you said about some of these underlying diseases, George, because I think we only discovered we had an issue with Neospora once we started testing for it, and my vet was absolutely shocked because we weren't getting the issues that you were. But as soon if we were moving them heifers onto another farm, then we would. And to be honest, I'd be mortified at that happening. So our view is we must sort that out. And that's very much about me. I wouldn't dream of selling anything like that. So I think that's really important. Is really go for the person, but also understand what you want. I think that's really important as well. You can go to sales, and I sell through sales, and you get quite seduced by that. But go and spend some time and look what you want and sort of really work it out. Often I'll have people come to me and I'll say, well, yeah, I might have what you want, but are you sure? And go around and have a look around first and spend some time. Because once you've got them, we made the mistakes as well in the early days. Actually, probably the mistake was we didn't spend enough money. That's a bit of a Yorkshire thing, if I'm honest. But and my dad even worse. But yeah, spend as much as you can, but obviously not just for the sake of it. But get the right cattle at the start, whatever, and that's whatever breed.
I think I might just add one thing, which I've had a lot of discussions with people about farmers about the finances involved with cattle and things like this. And there's one interesting thing I find as someone who is still growing their herds. We'll be breeding. We've got 28 to the bull at the moment. We run a spring and autumn calving block. So this year we'll, for the first time, be putting 50 animals to the bull. And when it comes to disease, I think you've got to be absolutely harsh on culling out or getting rid of that. That's an absolute. But when you're talking about the other issues you do get, which not necessarily the calving issues you do want to get rid of, but when you're then selecting for other traits and how harsh you want to be on them, for me, my realization is, especially considering I'm trying to build a relationship with a butcher, And when you're only sending 6 animals a year, you've got to be selling a really good story for them to be keen to be keeping on coming back next year. So my decision has very much been that, so for instance, at the moment, I've got a heifer. It's annoying because she's got a great name, but she seems to have an issue with New Forest eye. So she's not going to be a keeper. However, whilst I'm growing my herd up to my numbers, I know she'll calve well. So it makes sense for me to know to put her only to a fattening bull, know she's got an issue, know that line has an issue, but actually keep that until you get to your stage, and then you start culling out the lines that are bad. So I think if you're not careful, you cull way too hard at the beginning, and you've got no cash flow. Because you cull animals, you get bugger all money for them. So you've got to realise that, like, where that cash flow balance is. And that was a mistake I made a little bit a year or so ago, and I'm now kind of realising certainly you can get a bull that will solve some problems when you've been running a bull that maybe was a bit too big. Some animals will still calve okay with a smaller bull. So it's things like that.
The only thing I wanted to add, and this is sort of my experience being out there for the last 3 years, sort of speaking to farmers, and it was really interesting when we had Greg Judy here 3 years ago of what farmers were looking for in regen systems, and it's one of my obsessions is temperament, not just in the breeder, but actually in the cattle as well, because there's some issues sometimes there. But actually, it's absolutely key for me in a regen system. I mean, I'm sure George will second this, but sort of being in an arable farm, particularly, when we're talking about getting livestock back into arable systems, we want something that's going to stay in the bit we want it, not in the arable system, i.e. the arable crop. So to me, that's absolutely key. But also something that's easy to manage, and something that isn't going to give you a lot of stress. And temperament is just everything on that, in my view.
I think stress breeds stress, doesn't it? When you know it's going to be stressful when you're doing it. And that actually, in the research that Annie did, was one of the top things, like what do people select for differently now than before, that temperament was a really high-ranking thing. But I also agree with George there about, so we're saying all this, cull for this, cull for that, cull for this, cull for that. Well, if you cull for everything straight away, you've suddenly got nothing left. But cull doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of that year, just marking for maybe not keeping daughters from and stuff like that. Because I actually did that with the sheep in the beginning. I remember we'd have some with like just not great feeds, but yeah, you can get rid of a lot really quickly, and you spent a lot of money on some good breeding stock.
Yeah, on the sheep, it was definitely ability to stay within the fence was one of the top traits for one of the sheep producers I spoke to. So, yeah, comes to the bucket and can be managed. So, brilliant. I want to put it over to you guys now and see if there's any questions. Oh, wait a sec for the microphone. It's coming. Just wait. There we go.
Oh. You were talking about breeding for calving ease. Do people breed for hip size? Because if you have a cow which calves easily, it might calve easily because it has a small calf, and then the small calf grows into a smaller cow. So do people ever measure hip score or pelvic score, or is it called pelvic score, pelvic size?
You can pelvic score. There's also obviously the calving ease EBVs and things like that. I often don't. I don't know. Sometimes I'm not big into some of these things. It's just we don't notice often a big correlation between size of calf and calving ease. Often it's shape of calf, and I see quite a bit of variation. I think, like I say, looking how breeders are using it. Like I say, I don't do EBVs at home. My sales pitch is very much I don't have a calving jack, and we don't tolerate it. I'm sure somebody else, one of the other panelists, might have a more technical sort of approach to that. But I think you are relying on that breeder in terms of what data, when we talk about data, what they're putting in, what it's only as good as what we get out, and that sort of, I've got a big thing about honesty. And it'll go back, goes back to the person. Is the person you deal with going to give you a really straight answer? And are they going to say, actually, probably a good thing is, well, no, that bull isn't for you, but we think this one is because it'll achieve your objectives. So, yeah, having that conversation, I think, is really important.
So I was just going to say on that, just quickly, we don't do the scoring thing, but for us it's about outcomes. So actually, our cows are too big at the moment; they're too impactful on the land. We've gone with that kind of big is better mindset that we've had over maybe the last 50 to 100 years on breeding. Actually, our cows are too big, so we don't worry if we have a small calf. Actually, that's a good thing, and as long as that small calf then performs ongoing. So what we're looking for is easy calving or ongoing. So it's the outcome. It's what comes out the other end, not measuring the input. But I'm not saying that it's not a bad thing, but that would be what we would be looking for. And I don't see that we get this ever decreasing small size. I haven't seen that.
I just come. So we've just started doing pelvimetry this year, partly because we just wanted to try it. I don't believe there will be any useful data for us for at least 5 years. It's just purely an interesting thing. So I take all calf weights when they're born, just using a tape around their ankle. So I'm going to see how that correlation lies, but it's exactly this. Like, it doesn't, there's so many other factors that come in. So I know some of this is actually within EBVs, which I'll be honest, I don't really fully understand. They're confusing. But I do monitor gestational length. And for instance, I've got cows that are able to throw a huge calf, but they must have a massive pelvis, but they're calving at 300 days, not 285. So I'm trying to target a lower gestational length on them, which should in turn give that smaller calf as well. And I don't want a long gestational length on them anyway. But there is data out there, I can't remember the breed, but there was one breed that was a small breed, and the whole breed society thing was using pelvimetry to make sure they were carried on being easy calving, and now this breed is massive. So all you end up breeding for is when you focus purely and simply on one trait, unsurprisingly, is you end up breeding one outcome.
I think there was some concern a number of years ago within certain sort of bloodlines of Holsteins where people were breeding heifers from heifers because they were told, oh, that's how you get the most genetic gain. And of course, consequently, using easy calving bulls over easy calving bulls. And the animals ended up getting smaller and narrower at times. In terms of how we've seen it, you can certainly breed easy calving small calves that then make big strong cows. And it comes to, we don't do pelvic scoring as such, but we look at the conformation of the cows. If any are too pokey or whatever in the back end, they're prone to it, well, they're going to be less likely to have a chance to stay in the herd for long. And certainly if we have more than one or two calving difficulties in a block, then that's our fault either through breeding or feeding. It's very much, there shouldn't be an issue, and that's just observation and letting the ones that do the job right contribute to the breeding.
And I think that's really important, that the feeding thing. I was just going to come back on that. As often it's management as much as genetics.
There's one in the back over here.
Thanks for some excellent insights. I'm quite struck by how you don't really seem that keen on using data to inform your decisions, yet you've just portrayed a really quite astounding story about how you've brought in disease and you're not really sure about your calving outcomes and your cows are too big for the land. So could you maybe explain that a bit better? Because I find it really interesting.
Great question. So I think that maybe I might give the impression it's not that we don't use data. I don't focus on just EBVs. I think that might be it. So there isn't an EBV, for example, on large rumen size, or there's not an EBV on what's the other one on here? Kind of this kind of low maintenance or resilience. I guess that's another thing. Calves that do well consistently in a wet year, a cold year, a hot summer, cold spring, like that's what we need. Calves that do well in all those things, cows that do well in all of that. So I think that it's not that we don't look at data and we don't keep records like George is talking about. It's just that it's not only those things that we use to make decisions now, because that's Christopher from 3LM taught me this, and he said there is no instrument more sensitive than the human body for measurement, and just like our instinct as well, just like actually observation, what are we seeing? And that's an important part of it to kind of layer on. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, and I'd certainly agree that, yes, data is important, but we can get over-reliant on data, and it can be, you can get reductionist and focus on this or that, and actually we're talking about a very complex picture with lots of moving parts, and you'd have to have a huge amount of data points to analyse to make any sense of it. And I'd echo what Claire says about the human body being good at analysing data. I think I can certainly see the need for more data in a massive herd situation, etc. But I really think we should be talking more about, you know, people who work with their animals, know their animals. There's an innate wisdom there that you pick up over a lifetime, and if you spend the time, you know, I know lots of really good stock people who can spot little things, little differences, and you can't get a computer program to do that, and at least, you know, I'm sure they're working on it, but that human connection is really important, I think. And the human brain can analyse all these data points subconsciously, and if your living depends on it, believe me, you do have a pretty good go at trying to get the best outcomes for everything. Yeah, just my thoughts.
Do you want to add anything? Do you want anything, George? Or?
All I was going to say is I walk about my farm, I don't drive. And I walk about my stock every day. And I know very good stock people who drive to their stock and they check them by counting their numbers and they piss off. I have a list of all my cows. I know all of my cows at quite a far distance. And I look at them every single day. And that's how you know where you've got issues with them. And that's exactly all these other bits and pieces you derive from that. So yeah, observation for me is everything.
And just to add to that, sorry, I mean, what can sort of come as a bit of a replacement to data on everything is just having certain protocols in place. So you don't need to know everything about every animal if you've got a system in place that if this animal does this, she doesn't. So, for example, we've blocked calves spring and autumn for a number of years. We put the heifers to beef. We keep dairy replacements from the cows that calve in that first 3 weeks. Then it goes to a beef bull. So we're only keeping replacements for fertility. And there's little dodges like that you can just build into a system where you don't need to be analysing all the data. You're just nudging it in the right direction all the time. And sometimes if you're just using comparatives, I know that cow's better than that cow. I can only keep so many replacements. I'll keep the ones off those cows. Or, you know, yeah. Certainly not discounting data, but there's lots of things you can put in place to head in the right direction without spending ages analysing things or outsourcing it, because most dairy herds have got collars on the cows that tell them everything, rumination, temperature, great. Not knocking that at all, but that's nothing a good stocked person can't do. As long as your cows are being fed, you know, natural diets where they're not on a knife edge all the time, that's not doing anything a good stocked person can't do. I know there's labour constraints, etc., but
I think data is really important. I've probably just been an awkward bugger, but because everybody thinks data is important, so I'm suggesting something different. And certainly within the society we're trying to encourage people to take more and more data. We've just set up a SIRE reference scheme, so we actually can compare data between different herds, so we can all learn more from data. So yeah, I do think it's really important, but I think it's also we've probably been a bit rebellious with how we're coming across in that. We also want to recognise that stockmanship and that data that's on farm, and that's that data that's sometimes in there. It's just that probably as farmers and probably all four busy ones on here, we need to get better at writing it down and sharing it. And as chair of Breed Development Committee, I'm probably guilty of that, and some of my fellow directors look at me for that. But that's the reality, and we can get away with everything here, can't we? Because that's my context. You'll have discovered that over the last 2 days, that context is everything. So if nothing else you've learned from the 2 days, we can use context to get us out of most sticky situations. So yeah, there we go. Data's really important. I've said it.
Thanks. So there was a question over, is it still there? Over there? Yes, in this back corner. Yeah, thank you. Oh, wait a sec for the microphone. Thank you. Thanks.
What I was interested in knowing is whether there's a risk that we're selecting for cull animals that have an acquired abnormality rather than a genetic one, and whether anyone's recording that's shown, for instance, that the calf of a cow that has a particular disease is more likely to have that disease or not, because otherwise we might be selecting for things that are more environmental than genetic. Does anyone have any evidence either way, really?
Yeah. God, I think in terms of, you've probably got, it's a good question. I think you've got to break it down and understand your disease. Like Neospora, our experience of something that we didn't really think we had an issue in the herd, and then the vet didn't think we had an issue, was that when we discovered we did have an issue, and never open your emails just as you go into bed, particularly for your health stuff, because you won't sleep that night, was that it follows the family line. I can look back at one family line that we bought back in, I think we bought it back in 1998. It was a white heifer. couldn't get her in calf. Sort of back then we had things like beef special premium. You'll probably never get that mentioned again, but you'll remember that. And you tended, and suckler cow premium, you just tended to keep them. You would never dream of doing that now. She'd have been culled. But that was the start of Neospora in that family. That's why we couldn't get her in calf, because she had Neospora. But then we got it and she got settled on the farm, and it wasn't probably too much of an issue until I probably sold it to somebody else. So that's very much one that is following the family line, and the only way really to get rid of it is to take, and it's painful, but it's to take that family line out. Other thing, we found the same with Yonis actually, as George has said. You know, we can talk about all these other ways that diseases can be spread with rabbits and deer, etc. But Yonis, we were seeing it was going down the family line. So yeah, certainly on that, those two, which are the big two for me, you've got to take the hard decision.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk about those two again in particular. So Yonis will spread from the dam to the calf when it comes out. So that will be in that line. The question is then, that will then spread among your herd when those cows shed, if there are young calves about. Then you get issues, obviously, a long time down the line as to when they start withering away and having an issue. But do you really want that as a potential issue in your herd? Because there's not really a known kind of immunity to it. Neospora, there's a slight question mark on that, because in theory you get a certain number of generations down the line, they might be okay. As Fraser says, like, you get some lines are just fine. I had issues with two when I got them. Those two cows, one calf fine, one had a dummy calf the year later, but I had a bunch more that had Neospora and were absolutely fine. But if you think in the wild, those dummy calves would have died. So actually that line's not going to proliferate the same. So actually being harsh on a lot of these diseases not only protects you as a farmer, but is actually, to some extent, mimicking a natural process anyway. So,
I think in terms of environment versus genetics, certainly bad luck is heritable, and disease susceptibility can be heritable. And it's also in terms of there's obviously an epigenetic component to it as well, because, you know, if you've got healthy animals, they can pass things on to their progeny, which are over and above just the genetics of it. We haven't talked much on epigenetics, but I think it's pretty massive. And yeah, another thing is, you know, the one part is culling, and if you're culling for sort of minor health traits, you're automatically taking out anything that is susceptible to that kind of thing. But also, you know, I strongly feel if you've got animals on a natural diet, 100% pasture, minerally balanced soils, etc., they're pretty resilient to most things if you've got that combination of, you know, breeding the right way and feeding the right way, basically.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. Sadly, we're out of time, but I'm sure if you want to come forward and ask questions, then some people might hang around. But thank you so much for coming. Thanks. I hope you had a good festival, and I hope to see you next year.